Gio, the executive editor of the Post and Courier. Thank you for coming out on this nice and humid, sultry Charleston morning to join us for, I think this is our 4th Inside Business Live. We've been really enjoying putting on these programs and bringing the community together around topics that certainly have a significant importance to the overall community's health. And I think today's topic is no different. Tourism is certainly a hot topic for a lot of different reasons and a significant part of our economy and our community. And we're really lucky to have this great panel here that Robert and Emily will introduce here in a moment. But we just wanted to say thank you all again for coming, and thank you to the South Carolina Aquarium for their sponsorship of today's event. Great partners on community events like this, and looking forward to doing more with them in the future. I want to turn it over to our panel here and to our 2 journalists who will be asking the questions. Robert Vera has been with the Post and Courier for many years, covered many different beats, and Emily Williams is our tourism reporter on the business desk, and they're going to be taking it from here and asking some questions of our great panel here today. So thank you all for coming, and I hope you enjoy it.
If you would briefly introduce yourselves, and then the mayor, then we'll start with a question from the mayor. Winslow, you first.
Sure. Okay, I won't try to get the right distance. Good morning. Thank you for this opportunity. I'm Winslow Hasty. I'm the president and CEO of Historic Charleston Foundation, a local preservation nonprofit. Hopefully you all know of it. And I'm a lifelong resident of Charleston, and excited to be here. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Michael Tall, I'm the President and Chief Operating Officer of Charlestown Hotels. We're a management company, hotel management company, with about 50 hotels nationwide. And in the peninsula, on the peninsula we have 6 hotels, and in Charleston and whole, I believe we have 15. I've lived in Charleston since 2004, and honored to be here. Thanks for having me.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Angela Drake. I'm the past president of the Historic Ansonburg Neighborhood Association. I'm also involved in several task forces. I was on the Historic Tourism Task Force, the Task Force for Animal Care for Carriages, and also the Short-Term Rental Committee. I'm a resident of Ansonburg. I've lived in Charleston for a little bit, for about 22 years, and I am an active participant in hopefully helping the mayor with issues in Charleston.
She's also president of a Rotary Club and just got back on a 15-hour flight from the Rotary International Convention in Germany. So,
Correct.
John Tecklenburg, Mayor of Charleston.
Thank you so much to all of you for being here this morning. So like we said, we'd like to start with a question for the mayor. Obviously, in the last month, the Hotel Task Force has been meeting, and that hotel ordinance did receive first reading. So I'd like for you to explain a little bit what about these changes are different from past proposals. Why do you think this one is going to be successful?
Well, thank you, Emily. So I'm very pleased with the cooperation of a lot of folks, including Mr. Hasty that's sitting here with us this morning, but also representatives from the Convention Visitors Bureau, the hotel industry, and from neighborhood groups, that we were able to greatly improve this ordinance. It's similar to what I proposed a couple of years ago, but it is much better. This collaboration effort that occurred over the last month, it really improved it. It got first reading, so it's basically in effect now per our pending authority. So we've given the Board of Zoning and Appeals, Chairman Krawcheck and his other board members, the tools that they need to be able to better regulate new hotels coming to the city of Charleston. And with the 4,500 rooms that we currently have and 2,500 already in the pipeline, it was really needed for our city, y'all. The tourism industry is an important part of our economy, but it can't be the only part of our economy. And it's so strong because we're such a beautiful place. I mean, people want to come visit here. Wouldn't you? If you didn't live in Charleston, you want to come visit Charleston. It's a beautiful place to come visit, not like that. but we have to have a diversified economy, and my fear was with a tourism economy market so strong that any property that could become a hotel eventually would become a hotel. And that's why this ordinance is so important, to give the BZA the tools they needed, frankly, to be able to say no when appropriate. And that's what we've come to, and I'm real pleased it's passed.
And part of that task force conversation as well was not just getting to that ordinance, but there was also some conversation of maybe there's more to do after that. Maybe looking at the accommodations overlay at specific parcels. Can you speak to that a little bit? What might we see from maybe not that same task force, maybe the same task force beyond this ordinance?
Absolutely. So basically, the ordinance protects diversity of uses. So it protects residential uses, retail uses, office uses, doesn't allow hotels to displace those kind of uses, and has other requirements as well, and includes, by the way, a fee to help our city's affordable housing efforts, which is very important. Now, it's gotten first reading, so it goes to the Planning Commission. We'll be able to get some more public input and input from the commission there. Then the task force is going to meet again and consider those comments from City Council that we had during first reading, plus the Planning Commission. So there's still opportunity to improve the ordinance before it gets second and third reading. And then, in addition to that, as you mentioned, when the task force meets again, we do plan to review the accommodations overlay zone itself, because it makes sense. I mean, particularly the properties that, you know, might be a church or some institutional use. Let's go ahead and take them out of the overlay district. It just makes common sense. When the overlay district was set up 30 years ago or so, they just took a swath of the central business district and Market Street and made it this big accommodation zone where a hotel was possible, and they weren't really thinking about specific parcel by parcel. So I think that's an important next step, to take that map and go ahead and whittle down the overlay district as well. That doesn't mean that City Council can't, at a later point, add a property back to the overlay district if it wanted to.
Charleston, of course, regulates tours and tourism, and has for decades, very closely. One of the more, I guess, controversial aspects of this has been what the city does and doesn't do regarding cruise ships. That debate has largely been dormant since you took office, as different lawsuits have been pending. And of course, one of them is going to get a hearing before the state Supreme Court next week. And of course, we had the Carnival's new Carnival cruise ship that recently is tying up here, as well as, I guess, Carnival's announcement earlier that there's been a settlement in a case of, sort of a national case involving pollution from ships. What do you think it's important for residents and businesses to know about sort of the state of the cruise industry in Charleston, where it's going?
You still want me to?
Yes.
Before you got a whole panel there. Y'all, I think they're picking on me because, pardon me, I got to go in just a minute. This wonderful young lady, Katie Blomquist, she has this organization she started. She used to be a teacher up in North Charles called Going Places, where she gets together and gives a bicycle to every kid in the school. And we're doing Sanders Clyde at 8:30, so we're going to give away 450 bicycles in about 20 minutes. And I got to be through. So anyway, yeah, this issue has been mostly dormant, folks, because of the legal processes. There is a hearing next week. That's in the state permits over the pilings. The DHEC or DNR, some state agency have approved. That still remains an issue of federal matter with the court. So it could still be in the court for some period of time. You know, City Council passed, before I became mayor, basically codified by ordinance an agreement with the Port Authority that limited the number of port calls and the size of ships. To date, even though at this point with the new ship, we're basically bumping right at the limit of what's set in that agreement, but we're still just underneath that limit because they're allowing 104 ships a year and up to one ship at a time, and up to 3,500 passengers on a ship. So as of this point, there's been no violation of the agreement. That's not to say that it couldn't be codified further, but it was passed in an ordinance by City Council with agreement with Port Authority. And I think beyond that, there was the tourism management recommendations, which I still support. But for example, shore power for the ships, I think it's a great idea, not just for our local environment, but if you look at emissions worldwide and global climate change, I mean, the Port of Los Angeles, y'all, has done shore power, not just for cruise ships, but for all ships. So really, we ought to think about that. Why not Columbus Street? Why not the car carrying ships? Really, long term, to reduce emissions for climate change, we should be converting all of our port facilities to shore power, in my opinion. So that takes a big investment, you know, and that's something that would have to be funded and worked out over time, obviously. But the best place to start would be with the cruise terminal. But until the legal matters got resolved, you don't know where the terminal is going to be. Is it going to be where it is now, or is it going to move to where they propose? So in my practical thinking, it didn't make sense to spend $5 million where they are now, and then it gets resolved in court, and then move to another location. But I still fully support them doing shore power and living up to the agreement that we have, and looking at the expenses. I have asked city staff to look at the costs that are involved, because we do bill the Port Authority for direct costs, and we're taking a new look at the indirect costs of the cruise ships being here, because I think we could up the invoice a little bit.
Angela, I was going to ask you perhaps for your thoughts as a follow-up. Your neighborhood is about the closest to the passenger terminal. This is something I know you live
Yes.
with regularly.
You were reading my mind. For those of you, Ansonboro falls between East Bay and Meeting Street, Calhoun and Pinckney Street, so we're directly influenced by the cruise ships when they do come into town. We are affected by the noise, the dust, the tourists that do come to town, because they come directly into our neighborhood, which we welcome them. But at the same time, shore power is something that we need to address. As Mayor Tecklenburg just said, I was in Germany, in Hamburg, and they're addressing this issue as well. Offshore power is important to us all, just not domestically, but internationally. And we are going to Columbia on Tuesday, which is the hearing. There's many of us actually going by bus up to Columbia to raise an issue concerning the cruise ship industry here in Charleston. There's pros and there's cons, and both sides need to be addressed. And so we look forward to being in Columbia on Tuesday.
Anybody else want to chime in on that issue?
I'd be remiss if I didn't chime in for a second. The cruise debate has been raging for quite some time. It has sort of gone quiet, and it is coming back up because of this state Supreme Court hearing next week. But also, I think it's resurrecting because of this sort of general feeling within the local population that Charleston as a city sort of besieged a little bit. And so it's not just the cruise ships, but it's the hotels, it's the short-term rentals, it's all these things combined. And the cruise ships are just a very physical and obvious manifestation of this sort of notion of mass tourism, which I think we need to really be careful about. I would say, too, that regarding the Tourism Management Plan update, one of its recommendations was that we charge a head tax on the cruise ship passengers. And I do still think that that is a topic worth pursuing, and that we've got to figure out a way for the city, and not only just on the cruise ship passengers, but really in all of our tourist programs and projects, that we figure out a way to further have the tourism industry benefit the city, and therefore then the residents. I mean, we're working a lot on flooding infrastructure and focusing on flooding and sea level rise. And we all know that those are extremely expensive projects that we're going to need to invest in. And there's a limited pot of funds out there at the federal, state, and local level. So we got to be creative about how to raise money. And so I think this tourism, this wave of tourism is an easy, maybe not easy, but certainly a viable way to raise some additional funds.
Mayor, just one last thought before you leave, following up on Winslow's comment. The state legislature was considering a bill this year that would have allowed the city to use some of its hotel tax proceeds for drainage, which is not currently allowed under the statute. My understanding is the bill got some traction but didn't pass. Is that a fight you're going to keep pressing, and what do you make of the prospects of success there, and why is it important?
At the end of the session, we were in better shape than we were a year ago. It didn't pass yet, but I'm pretty confident that we'll get over the hump next year. And it's kind of a long-term resource for the city, an important one. But in the meantime, we've got enough tourism-related infrastructure projects like the low battery seawall and the streetscape in Market Street that for next year, we'll certainly be able to use all the available dollars that we could from accommodations for those projects, and they kind of tie in with our drainage project. But it would not be nice from a bonding point of view, particularly to have the specific authority for drainage projects in tourism areas as part of that legislation. I think we'll finally get over the hump next year. I hate to say, but it's not unusual that it takes a couple of years to get something through the legislature. Thank you all for having me this morning.
Going back to hotels for a moment, so Historic Charleston decided to appeal a hotel that was approved on Meeting Street, 252-room hotel, appealed that to the Board of Zoning Appeals, and then when that appeal was not successful, appealed further. So hoping you could speak to that. Why appealing that hotel? I know you said that, and the mayor has actually said this as well, that hotel was in a way the straw that broke the camel's back in terms of large hotels downtown.
Yeah, I mean, we've been focused on the hotel issue for quite some time, and you're right. I did characterize it as the straw that broke the camel's back, and frankly, that's the way it felt to us. We were right in the epicenter of the area that allows much larger hotel rooms. Actually, under the prior ordinance, it was an unlimited number of hotels if you met certain fairly minor requirements, frankly. And it's south of Line Street all the way down to Mary Street and then down by King and Meeting. And when we started looking at all the redevelopment sites within that zone, there were a huge number, including one we're looking at right out here and then just beyond the Post and Courier site. But then other very large redevelopment parcels that all could have been large, unlimited number of room hotels. And, we were very careful to incentivize dense development in this part of town. This is our central business district. We're sort of seeing the creation of a new midtown for Charleston, which has essentially never existed before. And, one of the reasons was that, this is a place to invest and to incentivize development. And when we meant development, it wasn't just hotels, of course. It was office space, and it was residential, and accommodations, and retail, and restaurants, and that diversity of uses that makes a vital downtown area. But as the mayor indicated, the way the market is tilted right now, the highest and best use is for hotels. And there seems to be an unlimited supply of equity and capital to be thrown towards hotels in Charleston. So when we started looking at this landscape, particularly in this zone, there was a huge number of redevelopment sites that, given the market and the fact that it is the highest and best use, would likely go in that direction. So when we saw the school law site as the 431 Meeting parcel get approved, and then in the paper to have Lenny Krawcheck, the chairman of the BZA, say, our hands are tied, this is terrible for the city, but we don't know what to do, we can't do anything. It's like, oh my God, okay. Clearly, this system is broken, and we sort of a little bit beg to differ in that we think that even the old ordinance does give the BZA, empowers the BZA to regulate hotels to some degree, because if not, then why would there even be the special exception process? I won't go through all the points of that special exception process, but there are many that give them power to regulate, and so we didn't feel like they applied the existing ordinance properly. But then we also are making an argument that the previous, an older, it gets confusing because there have been so many versions of this ordinance amendment, but the mayor had presented one back in August of 2018 that eliminated this zone here. And it had been considered by the city council and then ultimately deferred for further consideration and discussion. And then it just sat in the deferral a line item on city council agendas for months and months and months. But we were arguing in meeting with lawyers that actually we feel like even though it hadn't gotten a first reading, that it ultimately did what it did was legitimately what we call a pending ordinance, which the mayor touched on. So we thought there were a couple of legal questions that were important to answer, and frankly the other piece, which has happened and we're happy about that, but there's more work to do. But we really want to elevate discussion around hotels, and we are not a litigious organization, but there are times when litigation sometimes is the best way to elevate discourse around an important topic.
Michael, I was hoping you could speak to the hotel industry here, because this discussion about hotels, a tipping point with hotels, is very much about a mix of uses, more of a livability question, but hotels here are doing very well. We've seen record numbers of room nights, and even though there have been some dips in occupancy, our occupancy levels are still much higher than you see in most destinations. Can you speak to the health of the hotel market here in Charleston?
Sure. I made it 22 minutes. I thought I'd make the next 40 minutes without saying anything. I'm excited. Let's cross my fingers. Thanks, Ellen. Yeah. Listen, from a purely investment standpoint, Charleston is a great investment. 4 or 5 years ago, Charleston really became a pin on the map from a private equity standpoint. And that wasn't the case prior. It was Charleston's development on the hotel side had been, to a large degree, local developers, and continues to be with some projects. But certainly, money outside of Charleston wasn't something that we saw a lot of. And now, honestly, it's more than we know what to do with. So the health of the industry is extremely strong. You alluded to the number of rooms sold compared to occupancy. That's a difficult statistic to understand. But basically, Charleston is selling more hotel rooms than ever, countywide, citywide, and our occupancy is basically occupancy and rate. Occupancy is the amount of rooms occupied per night. Rate is how much you charge or how much you guys pays. That has remained essentially flat, dipping a little bit. Occupancy has, but it's misleading because the number of rooms sold has increased. So that the supply of the new hotels is taking that demand. So that's a measure, right? So if you're an investor, data drives private equity to develop, and the data says Charleston is a great investment, right? So that doesn't necessarily mean for us as locals that that's a good thing. But I can tell you the reverse is not a good thing. So it's our challenge to figure out how to balance that, and that's what the conversation is all about today. But our industry is very strong.
And what's remarkable is the hotel industry has gotten so strong and remains so strong even as short-term rentals have become a thing. Of course, this is something that the city's been discussing for a couple of years. They have passed an ordinance and new regulations and started enforcing them. But I'd be interested to hear from each of you about whether you feel like what the city has done is sufficient, is it working, or do you think there's more that should be looked at as far as bringing short-term rentals into into a good state.
Robert, I was on that committee, and I have to say the city reacted strongly to the committee's suggestions. The short-term rental committee met for about a year and a half, and meanwhile, the city actually hired 3 enforcement officers during that period to structure the code, to structure enforcement, and within the past year, they have actually found 2,000 unpermitted short-term rentals, meaning illegal, and they've pulled those off the market. They have actually brought 80 cases to livability court. They've returned 59 homes back to the residential structure of the neighborhood, and also established 250, let me get my statistics right here, 250 legal short-term rentals. So it has brought stability back into the residential fabric of the neighborhoods, because that's what short-term rentals were taking away from us. And the enforcement officers have worked with the fire marshal, with Dan Riccio, with livability, with the Preservation Society and the Historic Charleston Foundation, so that we can maintain the residential fabric of the neighborhoods. And that's important. I mean, you have the right to have a short-term rental, but you have to check the boxes. And you have to be legal, and you have to have a business permit. And there is, if you go online, there is a structure to having a legal short-term rental. So I have to say the city did respond in a timely manner.
And you feel comfortable with the status quo at this point in time?
I do. I really do, because the code enforcement officers are out there. They're looking. It's an issue of just doing the right thing and maintaining the business structure of, it is a business. A short-term rental is a business. And so you must pay a business license, pay your fees, pay your taxes, just like an individual business partner would. So yes.
Michael, does the hotel industry have a particular perspective on this?
I haven't sat on a panel in the last 4 years from a hotel standpoint that we don't talk about Airbnb or short-term rentals. It is every single conversation because it's a competitor to the hotel industry to some degree. One thing that Angela said that I completely agree with, I actually agree with most of everything she said, but the key is balance, right? The key is to, just like the task force which was created for the hotels, is to set a clear set of parameters on what it is, what the requirements are, what licensing you need, what permits you need, how it's structured, and laying that out so that people understand what it is they can and can't do and decide whether it's a viable business for them to go into. But the key to all of this is balance, right? Like, we are the first city that struggled with short-term rentals. I think it's every municipality across the United States, across the world, honestly, that has struggled might not be the way we're wrestling with it, because it is a new, it's a new component within the lodging economy. It's a new way to do business. So I think what we've done is great. Could we have done it faster? Sure, but I think understanding the components of it before you actually make decisions on it was a key piece. So I think we took our time as a city to understand what it was, and we've taken tremendous steps to try to regulate it and put it in the right framework.
And we have to understand too, it's just not the peninsula, it's Daniel Island, it's West Ashley, it's Johns Island. It's just not just affecting us on the island, we call it the island proper. It's affecting us as a whole. And when you go into that structure, that's when you need to explore. That's why short-term rentals need this regulation.
Right, that's what I was exactly sort of the question I was going to pose for Winslow. Your organization hears from residents, not just Angela's neighborhood, or historic neighborhoods, but really across the city. Are you feeling good about where we are as far as regulating short-term rentals?
Well, I mean, I do want to recognize that the city and city council adopting the regulations, and it was controversial because they're pretty strict. I think they're some of the most strict regulations, particularly in the historic district, that you can find anywhere in the country. So that is excellent. I think the bigger issue is just the size and scale of the problem. And it's just going to take a long time to weed out the bad actors and work on the enforcement side. And the city did respond in kind, as Michael said and Angela mentioned. I mean, lots of new enforcement officers in the livability department. They invested in software that combs the web to find these illegal postings, listings. So they've got the tools, but I think the problem is just the scale of the issue. So while we've seen some good movement, there's probably thousands more out there that are still operating illegally. It's just going to take time, not only to identify them, but then to take them through the process of the violation kind of enforcement process through the livability court, and that just it's slow. So I think we're hopefully just the knowledge that this is out there is going to be a deterrent, right? But I think it's one of these things you cannot rest on your laurels, and it's going to require constant vigilance.
To pivot to something else a little bit, something that I think we're talking about in every industry far beyond the tourism industry is finding talent, and with unemployment as low as it is, finding and retaining talent. And I think that's definitely a challenge for the hospitality industry. The Federal Reserve's latest economic outlook for the region mentioned Charleston again. That hospitality contact said that labor shortages led to cutting back on services, that some restaurants couldn't find enough staff, and then several months ago, another Federal Reserve report noted that a hotel was having trouble finding staff and couldn't fully operate because of that. So, Michael, I was hoping you could speak to that, especially from your role with Explore Charleston right now. I know that workforce piece has become such an important component, and really a newer component to what the organization does. So I'm hoping you could speak to that.
Yeah, no, it is clearly our industry's biggest hurdle. I think employment rate now is around 3%. I think in our industry, it's around 11%. Right, so just as the open positions, right, like is 3 times what it is in the general industry. So workforce development, right, is key for us as a company and as a city. And I think, from the Explore Charleston standpoint, we are making a huge commitment to the education of college students, high school students, that tourism is an extremely viable career path, right? And so not only do we deal with transportation and parking and those sort of things that, especially on the peninsula, in recruiting as an industry, that's extremely difficult. We have to understand the wage scales and all that. But I think it starts in the classrooms, and it starts with, I started when I was 15 in the industry cleaning clay courts in Hilton Head. That was my first job. And I haven't been in the industry since, right? So I think if you introduce hospitality and tourism to someone when they're in high school, when they're in college, it provides quite a career path. I think the average earning for someone who started their career in hospitality is $82,000 a year. So it is a viable career for people. And I think the education of that, we tend to get lost in it sometimes. And somebody may wait tables, they may start out, doing tours for John or whatever it may be, and then they go and they move to another city or they do something else. It's our responsibility to try to keep them in that. And so it is, as I said, is our industry's largest hurdle right now is to find great people to recruit, to make sure that they experience, they have a career path laid out for them, we develop them, and keep them in our industry.
Noting that as the industry's biggest challenge right now, our other 2 panelists can kind of speak to that in different ways.
And a question for you. Does it boil down to transportation? I know we've addressed that issue with workers coming in, team members coming in by bus, having flat parking lots, but that's addressing the peninsula's issue. But there's other areas too in this region. It's a regional issue. And we've done well with the high schools and educating them in the tourism industry, with Trident Tech, with the culinary institutions. But does it really boil down to transportation? If the dishwasher is sharing a car with his sister and is only making $15 an hour and can't reach his destination of employment by public transportation, is that what it boils down to?
Well, it doesn't boil down to anything. It is a component of everything. Transportation is a huge piece of it. Parking for the peninsula is a huge piece of it. If I can make $15 an hour and drive up to, the DoubleTree up in North Charleston and park in the parking lot, and I can make $15 an hour, and I gotta come down here and work in the DoubleTree, right? Like, I have to pay for parking, it's gonna take me twice as long, so why wouldn't I opt to work at the, so that's a piece that, when you're in a certain location, you have to figure that out. So, transportation and parking are huge pieces of it, but it boils down to somebody actually committing to our industry and us making sure that we create the career path for someone to grow. That is the elixir. Sure, dishwasher or housekeeper that is making making a wage, and every dollar matters on gas and parking. Those are all components that are related to our industry. But I think that dishwasher is hopefully a general manager one day for one of our hotels, right? Or is the F&B director at one of the restaurants. And so it's our commitment to get that person there, as opposed to creating obstacles for them to get there. But transportation is an obstacle.
And I think we're at the part of the program now where we're interested in hearing from you and what's on your mind. So does anybody have a question, I think, that they'd like to pose? Charles?
Robert,
You want this?
My question I have is really for the mayor, who's not here to defend himself anymore. But I personally think that the cruise ship industry is one of the most important threats to the city of Charleston. And I could talk on that for a long time. But he talked about the limits of 104 that we're about knocking on, and he talked about the ordinance passed by city council. But as I understand it, and I'd like someone to correct me if I'm wrong, there's no legally binding limit. It's all just kind of fluff.
Yeah, that's correct. Essentially, there is no penalty if those are exceeded. The only mechanism in the resolution, I think, is there would be some public meetings or public hearings to discuss what's going on. So,
If I could, I'd just weigh in on that. Yeah, it's a completely voluntary agreement, non-binding, and essentially what is built in is that the Ports Authority would have to give notice, a year's notice, if they wanted to change it, and that would trigger public hearings at City Council. But frankly, there's no mechanism to prevent them from escalating. They just have to give you a year's notice. Let me just quickly say too, through both the federal litigation as well as the state litigation, part of that is to truly codify those restrictions, because we're already seeing what's happening, and we know from looking at global trends, the cruise tourism, the cruise industry is all about vertical integration and massive exponential growth, and the ships are just getting bigger. The numbers of travelers are getting larger, and so you can see the future pretty clearly, and that's why we think it's super important to have those legally codified, binding agreements.
My name is Judy Brazington, and I live at 328 East State Street. In fact, we restored one of the homes involved in Historic Charleston. We have since downsized, and we're over at Lawrence Place. And we are so close that if they move the terminal, we can literally reach it. We hear every word they say. They do the ding, 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 and then they give announcements. I've got pictures, and the pollution is horrible. The people are very nice that come in on cruise ships. We have no objection to that. But we have not had the best relationship over the years with the SBA, because they will make us a promise and then it doesn't really come through. With all of the cars that are coming, with the much larger ships, it's a matter of the fact that it's ridiculous, because we have children playing soccer in the wonderful park that is in our area. We have the International African American Museum, which is going to be right next door to us. But in the vision of the city, they added 0 parking spaces to that museum. So, we don't know what's going to happen with that. We have the wonderful aquarium. We have a lot of businesses. Our population is growing dramatically in that area. And they, of course, have torn down places like Brewer's Paint Store, and we lost the hardware store. We lost the vegetable bin, which was so important to those of us in Ansonboro and over where all the condos are now. And we want to be good neighbors, but we feel very strongly that where the Crooks Terminal, if we don't win, and they're not allowed to move, if it at least is left where it is closer to the commercial area. It's closer to where the hotel, where the court sold that property, and they're there for a night or two. They're not there for 365 days a year. So we feel so very strongly that we just need help, and we need to, muster together the strength. In regards to the hotels, I'm kind of jumping from one thing to another, but I read a wonderful letter to the editor. I think it might have been I don't know, maybe it was actually something from, but it indicated, of course, where you used to have a small store that would have a bathroom, and they might have 4 or 5 employees, whether it was a furniture store, or whether it was, just a little shop or whatever, locally owned. Well, now you've got hotels. You have a situation where you've got hundreds of people taking showers in Charleston more than once a day, because when you go out, you come back in, you're hot. You've got all of the, changing the sheets, even though you do suggest we're trying to use your towels twice, that doesn't really occur. And so you've got, when you're talking about the water levels and what is happening with our sewage systems, you've got the restaurants, you've got everything going on, and that's all being flushed into our systems. And, I love the hotels. We owned a bed and breakfast. We had a 4-room bed and breakfast, and we bought a parking lot right next to us. And we followed all the regulations, and it was wonderful. We really spent time with our guests. So we feel like, and having lived by the port, when the train track was actually running in the middle of Washington Street, several of us identified that when the port actually moved it, which was wonderful to have it out of the street, they actually at that point ended up not putting a proper bed in the railroad track. And the plaster and all of the work we had done with renovations and restorations was an issue. So some of us ladies were walking by, and we talked with the workers, and they said, oh, no, that's what the port told us to do it the cheapest way possible. When they did the asphalt to put the little BMWs, because we were beside the car carriers, again, they did not put proper drainage in. So the water, even now, flows over into Lawrence Street, just gushes over. We would call and we'd say, you got a situation where the water's almost up to the doors on your cars. I were buying a new car, I wouldn't want to buy one. When they were asphalting it, they went down East Bay Street. We had a beautiful brick sidewalk right in front of our house at 328 East Bay Street. It was dropped all over. And Ann Moise, who was wonderful, picked up my husband's shoes, had them cleaned, and brought them back because we couldn't even get into our home. So we have had a love-hate relationship, but as I say, there's so much going on. And we as residents do count. We're the ones who literally, and there's just so many things that we appreciate people getting involved, and, we've got to take a stand. Thank you.
Well, I need your name and number because in Ansonboro, we're actually putting together a task force to study what is actually going on the port's property. We've been given several plans for many years, but what is the comprehensive plan? Because whatever is built there, whatever is moved or not moved, or a new park or new hotel, that does affect the storm drain system as a whole, and for your neighborhood, for my neighborhood, for the city. And that's what we need to start looking at with all this hotel development is it's not individual hotels, it's what is the master plan and how does it tie in. The mayor spoke of the market renovations that are going to be going on down Market Street. And that system, that storm drainage system affects our neighborhood dramatically, as well as the 110-room hotel that's being built on the old First Baptist site. So please give me a call.
Judy, you covered flooding, you covered cruise ships, hotel development. You left out 526, so I was hoping that was next. And I was like, yeah. That's actually development.
Good morning. You mentioned about Explore Charleston. I'm not exactly familiar with it, but it seems like it was a concept as far as, is it the hotel industry or hospitality industry?
So the Explore Charleston is our convention and visitors bureau. So
Okay,
it's the
alright.
tourism arm of Charleston, sorry.
Well, I've heard a lot in regards to, I guess, the parking, but the investment, I guess it's the industry as a whole, with how they help the employees, whether it be transportation, but I guess housing as well. I guess that idea where you're mentioning that you can have the advancement, that would be probably, I guess, be broadened, I guess, with the food and beverage industry as well, as far as deciding, instead of maybe just the hotels itself, have more apartments or condos that would be available for mid, I guess, income residents. I know the latest thing as far as that best use would be high-end or whatever the catchphrase is as far as what apartments are. Over the weekend, when I see people coming in, I think the comment was made with some of the new apartments. It looks like I have to be a student to get a good place to live, because some of the places are geared towards that. But overall, I was just saying that that seems something that I guess as a whole, both the hospitality and I guess apartments, hotels would work together so you could have that balance. I grew up on the peninsula, I live in Mount Pleasant now, and that's something that, whether it's downtown or just overall area, that's something that we need. I think with affordable living, that's one component, but the industry is as well could work together.
100%. Yes. So I saw Mike Steekins walk in. I wouldn't mind him saying something real quick about this, because the new ordinance, right, includes the assumption of properties that currently have residential, or currently have apartments, or currently have a business that's contained, which prohibits a hotel from coming in and completely taking over that and not making any kind of an exception for that. So, Mike, do you want to talk about like the lodging component and how that incorporates the apartments or the residential that somebody can't replace?
So one of the things we've built into the ordinance is, one is a prohibition about replacing any existing or prior existing 7 years backwards office space. And then if you are replacing any existing residential, there has to be provisions made to replace that residential. And we prefer, because of the fee in lieu, that that residential fall into attainable housing within a certain area, distance from where you're going to be building the lodging. So it has done two things. It's given us a wider pool of development. It's also put into an area diversity. So we think that'll work, and we're going to have to see how that all goes as we sort of build all of this in. And I think you'll see some good, diverse, and closely tied in geographically development, which then allows us access to transportation and all of those things. So that's the goal, and there'll be some bumps along the way, but I think we've off to a pretty good start.
Yeah, the key to all that is balance, right? If we want to be a working city, we want to be a city that attracts tourists, but we also want to be a working city where people live in the city, right? And we are at a critical point to make the decisions that is going to set the next 50, 100 years of what Charleston looks like. And the great thing is, and I alluded to this earlier, is we have the tailwinds to do all of this, right? It's not, there are many cities out there that are trying to find tourists, there are many cities that are trying to find people to live in the downtown area of the city. And we are in a prosperous position to make these decisions. And it's a great position to be in, and now is the time. Because the opposite is not a good position.
And Michael, I have to agree. I think we're not at a tipping point. We're at a pivotal point where we do have the opportunity to make a difference. We've got the forces behind us. We've got the city. We've got businesses. We've got corporations. And we also have residents that are looking to make a difference in the next generation.
If I could just tag on to that, it sort of ties back to something I said earlier, which is trying to think of creative ways to sort of monetize the success and the attractiveness of Charleston for the benefit of the locals and the residents. We had a consultant that we brought in several years ago to look at the issue of gentrification and displacement in one neighborhood on the peninsula. And, you know, one of the things that he said is much exactly what Mike was saying, which is, you know, Charleston is in a really successful position and you're in a good place to leverage your success in a way that you can, he said, essentially turn the success of Charleston into an ATM machine of sorts, because we have opportunities to create revenue to help with attainable housing. So one of the things around the hotel ordinance is that we essentially are building in an impact fee that you have to, that any hotel developer will have to pay into, and it's based right now, we're probably going to tweak this, but based off the square footage of the hotel, and it goes into the city's affordable housing fund. And that's for all new development, not even projects that are displacing residential. But I think, again, back to this notion of a head tax, or, you know, we have a lot of hospitality tax, we have accommodations tax, and that's great. But I think there's other ways that we can monetize our visitors and also the development that's happening here in ways to address not only attainable housing, but improvements to transit and transportation, and also flooding and resiliency infrastructure. So I think for me, that's where we really need to be progressive and really smart and strategic.
Any other questions?
I think this is more of a comment than a question, but following up on what Winslow just said, Dana Beach has written about this quite a few times, that the accommodations tax in Charleston is already being well used. It's being used by the city for fire and police, and it's being well used by cultural organizations, CBB. And it's really a drop in the bucket, what we need to address the flooding issue. So instead of chasing around to trying to find drops in the bucket, we need to find other sources, and we need to find bigger ways to fill that bucket. And so I just want to, suggest that. I wish the mayor was still here, but he's not. But instead of sort of spinning our wheels, trying to find drops, let's figure out ways to find handfuls of water to address the flooding issue. Because that money, like I said, is already being very well used. I agree totally with Winslow that we need to figure out other ways to monetize the visitors here. Thanks.
Just sort of had a question that Emily and I talked about yesterday. Since I moved to Charleston in 1990 and began covering the city shortly afterwards, and even back more than 2 decades ago, there was concern about the success of tourism, and would it kill the goose that laid the golden egg? Essentially, would too much tourism, too much success in tourism actually undermine itself over the long run? You hear the sort of the tipping point concept. This is something that Charlestonians have been talking about for a long time, and yet during that time, interestingly enough, it seems the industry's only gotten stronger and healthier. I think many people, at least the people who are responding to those Condé Nast surveys, would agree that we haven't crossed the tipping point yet. But one thing I'm interested in to hear from each of you is this idea of how do we measure that? How do we get a sense of whether we've crossed the tipping point? Because as the mayor made his case for regulating hotels, he came up with a metric. He looked at the number of hotel rooms per resident and compared Charleston to Savannah, New Orleans, San Francisco, and other popular tourism cities. And that number, I think it was, I forget the exact number, but it sort of gave us comfort because we were pretty much in the middle, maybe even on the low end as far as the number of hotel rooms per resident. But it was a good kind of objective way to measure the hotel rooms and the presence of hotel rooms given the size of the city. I'm sort of interested in each of you thoughts as far as what sort of metric, what sort of measurable should we be paying attention to going forward as we determine whether Charleston's tourism is tilting too far toward the visitor and away from the resident?
Just go down the line,
Sure.
I guess. Okay. It's a great question, and Robert, you're so right. I mean, you can look at accounts from right when the preservation movement was just getting started in the 20s and 30s in Charleston, and they were at a tipping point then. So it's really interesting. You see this sort of a chorus about the tipping point, but it doesn't mean that it's not a legitimate question to ask and one that we should be concerned about. And it is talked about a lot, killing the goose that lays the golden egg. And you know, I was going to bring up the hotel point that Jacob Lindsay did a lot of research into this when we were looking at making amendments to the hotel overlay. And what he did say, though, and this is what I think really got the attention of the task force, was yes, when we look at other cities around us, we're doing okay. But if you start to build in the pipeline projects and then the hotels that we know either are in process, entitlement process, or coming out of the ground, or ones that we're fairly certain are going to happen, it was another 50% on top of that. And that would then bump us up into the Savannah, New Orleans realm, which I think all of us would agree is not a healthy place to be. I mean, those are cities that have really allocated enormous real estate in their city centers to tourism. And I think we would caution ourselves to stay away from that. So, that was super helpful, and I agree that having some metric, and I don't know what that is. However, when I look at the Office of Tourism Analysis at the College of Charleston does a lot of, Daniel Gugentag and his group do a lot of analysis of this stuff. And, when you just see the growth curves in terms of visitation, what are we looking at year over year? It's roughly 400,000 plus more visitors a year. I think we went from 6.7 to 7.3 or something like that, but just in 1 year. That's not sustainable. So, I mean, you just look at that, and again, these tourists are all coming, for the most part, to a very, very small, concentrated area of the city. They are all coming down to the southern tip of the peninsula because that's where the carriages are, it's where the house museums are, which we own 2 of, and we love them. That's where the Battery is, Rainbow Row, you name it. So everyone wants to come to this very small area. And so the problem is, unlike other major tourist cities around the world, what people are coming to see are not big public monuments or civic spaces. They're really the residential neighborhoods, and those are owned and invested in by private residents. And I think the bellwether is going to be when people no longer want to live downtown anymore or in the historic district. And what then happens is you don't have people that are investing in these houses, in these large houses, paying the taxes, paying the insurance, paying the upkeep. That's what everybody's coming here to see. So I think there is this feeling on the part of the residents that they're sort of bearing the brunt of all of this, and it's sort of out of whack. And they're not feeling the support or the benefits of tourism. They're only seeing the downside. So, that's going to be a bellwether that I certainly don't ever want to see. So what we need to do is try to stay ahead of that so that we don't see disinvestment in the historic district and a sort of mass flight of people who, frankly, have the means to live just about anywhere. And so that's my fear. I'm sure there's some metrics out there. We've actually been looking at it internally within the Historic Charleston Foundation to look at people out there nationally and internationally who study these types of things who might be able to help us determine what that metric is.
Winslow covered a lot of territory there. A couple things to touch on. One is, we talk about the historic district a lot, and yes, it is our cultural center, the number one reason people come to Charleston's history. However, the lion's share of the hotels being built are outside of the peninsula. we have made a huge commitment to air service to Charleston. This is bringing us corporate travelers. Boeing is here, Mercedes is here, Volvo is here. These are corporate travelers. These are business travelers. We call them leisure, if in fact they are traveling for business and they find time to do fun stuff, whether on the front end or the back end of the trip, or whether they're mixing it into the trip. So while the historic district is our center, if you will, not all of these people are coming downtown. There's a hotel being built in Muldoons, there are hotels in North Charleston, West Ashley, Mount Pleasant, and they aren't necessarily coming into Charleston. The great thing about the growth of our city and our region is there are many pockets, neighborhoods, if you will, have developed that people consider a destination. So whether you look at them as the 5 boroughs of Charleston, or you look at it like they do in New York, people will stay in an area that they are vacationing, or even if they're working, whether it be Mount Pleasant or whether it be Isle Palms. And so a lot of our concentration is on the historic district, as it should be. But we have to realize that 50-some people move here every day too, right? Or whatever that number is. So it's not just tourists that are the cars on the street, right? Those license plates are South Carolina a lot. They're not Michigan, they're not New York, right? So I think that we have to keep that in mind. As we talk about, the tipping point and the metrics around whether we've jumped the shark, I guess is what you say if we're talking Hollywood. The visitors determine that. It's a hard metric to peg. The one that we've used so far, I think, is a good one. The challenge is, I think Yogi Berra said, right, and nobody goes there anymore, it's too crowded, right? Like Charleston, we have to be careful because our industry is driven by the preferences of our guests, of our clients, right? Their preferences are for experiential insertion into a culture that exists. And so if we become nothing but a tourism, t-shirt shop kind of place, they're going to stop coming. And they're going to tell us that they don't want to come anymore. And then it's too late. So if we have the capacity to continue the livability, the residential companies, hotels, restaurants, attractions, but the things that we do as citizens, they want to do what we do, right? Guests to Charleston and every other city, the preferences have changed so much in 20 years. When I go to a city, when I go to a destination, I want to do what the locals are doing. So if the locals, we're not staying in our hotels, right? So like that they need a place to stay while they're here. And they want to do what we're doing. They want to eat where we eat. They want to hang out in the neighborhoods we hang out in. And that's, our industry is completely moving in that direction. So if we falsely create things that are just tourism driven, then we're going to push away the people that we want to have in the first place. And so that's a delicate balance. But our guests and our visitors will tell us, hopefully it's not too late, whether or not we've jumped the shark or not.
And to piggyback on that, I'm glad some of these restaurants keep tables for locals, by the way. It's a good thing. I do represent Ansboro, which is one of the 5 boroughs, and I do live in the historic district. And to piggyback on both of these gentlemen, it is a fine line between the residential fabric of the neighborhood and tourism. I have to applaud special events, the group within the city, because at one point we were having the Bridge Run, the Flower Town Festival, the tennis tournament all on the same weekend, and you couldn't leave your neighborhood. And they have coordinated it so that the events are regional instead of just historically based on the peninsula. And at the same time, Winslow, you mentioned residents who do live here or who have lived here or from the peninsula, they do sometimes say, I've had enough. And we need to reach that balance so that the residents are saying, this is a great place to live. I love living here for a reason, and they do live here for a reason. Because we do have a community, and a lot of cities don't have that sense of community. And we have to retain that balance by working with the hotel industry, by working with the city, by working with our local neighborhoods so that we maintain that steady balance. Because Charleston is Charleston. you can't replace it. And we live here because of one reason, because we enjoy living.
All right, it's a good place to end, I think. So we're going to wrap it up today. I appreciate everybody coming in. I think our guests and our journalists will be here mingling around for a little while longer, hopefully. So we can continue the conversation, or you can have a rest of your day. Thank you for coming, and thank you again to the South Carolina Aquarium for being a sponsor today. And we appreciate you all stopping by. Thanks.